Hello UCE parents, families. Welcome to our last week in our theme of story for this month. I hope all's been well with you. Yes, I'm going to make this the last week even though we have one more week in the month. And that is because there's a holiday and I figured you would rather be out and about and doing fun things, maybe even going away this year for the holiday weekend. I hope you can do whatever fills your spirits. So, for our last week of the theme of story, we are going to focus on the segments At the Bedside, The Extra Mile, and Our Blessing. First, At the Bedside. This is a part where you have a story, sometimes two stories, that you can use at bedtime or other times during the week, whatever fits your family's musings and schedules. And this week, our story is called The Storytelling Stone. It is a Seneca tale that was told by Joseph Bruchac in a book called Return of the Sun, Native American Tales from the Northeast Woodlands. Now, I've heard different versions of this story, and you may have heard versions of it too other than this. But this is the one I'm going to tell from our packet. And it goes like this. Long ago, the people had no stories to tell. It was hard for them to live without stories, especially during the long winter nights when the snow was deep outside the lodge and the people longed for something to give meaning to their lives. If only there was something we could listen to, the people would say. But there were no storytellers and no stories to be told. In those days, in a certain village, there was a boy whose parents had died and whose other relatives wouldn't care for him. The boy's name was Gaka, which means crow. He lived by himself in a small lodge made of branches, and among his few possessions were a bow and arrow which his father had made for him. And because he had to take care of himself, he became a very good hunter. He carried a small tobacco pouch which his mother had made, telling him that it was good to make an offering of some tobacco to thank an animal's spirit whenever he was successful in hunting. Well, the people in the village did not treat Gaka well. They made fun of him, laughed at his ragged clothes. Finally, one autumn, Gaka decided to leave the village and find a better place to live. He traveled for many days. He walked and walked until he came to a place where a large stone stood. It looked like a good place to camp, so he made a fire, sat in front of it, thinking about his life and wishing that he had something to offer his people, something which would lead them to respect him. It was dark now, and Gaka felt lonely. He leaned back against the large stone and spoke. "If only I had something interesting to hear," he said. "Give me tobacco and I will tell you something," a deep voice said. It sounded as if it came out of the earth itself. Gaka looked around and he could see no one. "What will you tell me?" Gaka said. "Give me tobacco and I will tell you something," the voice said. Then Gaka realized that the voice was coming from the great standing stone behind him. He reached into his pouch and placed some tobacco on the base of the stone. "Speak, grandfather," said Gaka. "I will now tell a story," said the big standing stone. The story of the earth itself, of the woman who fell from the sky and the animals and birds who helped her. Gaka listened to the story. It was the most wonderful thing he had ever heard. He listened hard, trying to remember every detail. At last, the story was over. Gaka waited And the voice spoke again. When a story has been told, it will be a custom to give the storyteller a gift. Gaka pulled some beads from his deerskin fringe on his old worn jacket and placed them at the base of the stone. Here, grandfather, thank you for the story. From now on, when one announces they will tell you a story, you must say nyayo. And when the storyteller says ho at any time in the story, you must answer hey to show that you are listening. I will now tell a story. Nyayo, said Gaka. Then the great stone began to relate a tale of the animals and people and how the bear's tail came to be short. Each time the stone said, ho, Gaka was quick to say, hey. As before, Gaka listened closely, trying to remember every word. Too soon the story was ended and the great stone was silent. Then it spoke again. This is as long as my stories will go on this night. Gaka was sorry to have the stories end, but he placed a few more beads on the base of the great stone. Thank you, grandfather, he said. And he went to sleep, holding every word of the stories in his mind. And when he woke the next day, he wondered if he had dreamed it. But the bone beads were gone, and he found that he still remembered the stories. He had eaten all his food, so he took up his bow and arrows and went hunting. As always, his luck was good, and he managed to shoot several birds. As he circled back towards camp by the stone, he came across a village. Some of the people in the village welcomed him and asked him to sit by the fire. Would you like something to hear? He said. No, the people said. Give me some tobacco and I will tell you a story of how the earth came to be. Each time I say ho, you answer me by saying hey. The people did as he said. They listened closely and answered each time he said ho. Before the end of his tale, everyone in the village was gathered around him to listen. And when the story was done, they all gave him presents. They asked him for another tale, offering him more tobacco. I shall tell you how the bear lost his tail, Gaka said. Do you want to hear the story? No, the people said. And when Gaka was done, the people begged for another story. No, Gaka said. That is the length of my stories this evening. I must return to my lodge. He promised to return again the next night, and he went back to his camp by the standing stone, carrying the presents with him. He placed tobacco on the ground and spoke. Grandfather, I am ready to listen again. I shall now tell a story, said the deep voice of the stone. And so this went on for a long time, and each evening Gaka would share the stories with his friends, and each night the big standing stone will tell new stories. One evening, after finishing his storytelling, a girl about Gaka's age approached him. She handed him a decorated pouch. You have many stories, she said. Perhaps you can use this pouch to keep them. Gaka thanked the girl, took the pouch. From then on, each time he learned a new story, he would put something in the pouch to help him remember the story. For example, a blue jay feather reminded him the story of how the birds got their clothing. And a small wooden turtle reminded him of the tale of Turtle's race with Bear. As the days and weeks passed, his pouch became filled with stories. And each time Gaka went to the village, he saw that girl who gave him the pouch. And they became good friends. And finally, the girl brought him to her house. As soon as he walked through the door, The girl's mother looked up at them and smiled. I see that my future son-in-law has finally come through my door. The next day, the girl came to Gaka's camp carrying a basket of bread. I have brought you this because my mother agreed that we should ask you to marry me. Gaka took the bread and ate it, and he and the girl were married. Now the two of them lived together in his lodge near the stone. And they lived well there because Gaka was such a good hunter and because he had been given so many useful things by the people of the village to thank him for his stories. All through the winter he listened to stories until it was time for spring. Then the big stone spoke. The time for stories has ended. Now the earth is waking up and the stories must sleep. After the first frost, I will tell more stories. The next day, Gaka told the same thing to the people of the village. Gaka and his wife spent a happy spring and summer together. They planted corn and beans and squash and took part in the life of the village. And when the first frost came, the storytelling stone began once again to share its tales of the old days with Gaka, who was now a young man and no longer a man. So it went for a long time, and finally, one day, the stone ended a story and was silent for a long time. Now I shall tell no more stories. I have told you all the stories from the old time. From now on, the stories will be carried by the people, not kept in the stones. You, Gaka, are the first storyteller, but there will be many more storytellers after you. Wherever they go, they will always be welcomed. And from that time on, that is the way it has always been. The end. So some questions for your family to think and talk about and share your thoughts on after this story are, what do you think the people liked so much about the stories? Why do you think they liked Gaka's stories so much? And how did the stories change Gaka's life? And did Gaka change the stories? What kind of stories do you like to tell? And what kind of stories do you like to hear? Are they the same kind of stories? Or does it matter who is telling the story? And lastly, what happens to stories when they get told many times over and over again? Think about the game telephone. Even though you're not telling a whole story in that game, it does change after you tell the story or the phrase over and over. Do you think that's good? That stories change over time a little bit? Our next segment is the extra mile. And in our packet this month, our author asks, or suggests, I should say, to make a story basket. Now, if you're familiar with this spirit play program at some of our UU churches and congregations, this may sound familiar to you. The idea of a story basket is you take a favorite story book, or if it's a story just printed out on a piece of paper, and you put it in a basket or a bag, and you add little items that represent parts of that story to your basket or bag. So if there are people in the story, you can find little figures of people like Legos or dolls, whatever. Or if they're animals, little stuffed animals, things like that. And in the packet and in the comment section below is a link to a document that is created by religious educators all over. You can read some of the stories, pick one that sounds fun to you to use as a starting place for your story basket, or just choose one of your own favorite stories or books. So each time you tell the story, add something to your basket or bag. And so many stories have different themes and angles that you can tell the story from. Different things that you can point out, such as with stone soup. First you think, oh, it's about stones. Well, no, it's also about food and people and community. You can also ask your kids for ideas on things to put in the story basket that represent the story to them, and have them fill up the basket. And below in the comments, I put a link to this document, as well as a page to a website on suggestions on how to create story baskets. And there are like 5 different examples or types of story baskets that you could create, depending on the ages of your youngsters or just your approach to storytelling, I guess. So check those out. Also in our packet, there's a mention of a radio program called The Moth that has storytellers, not necessarily professional storytellers, but pretty good storytellers. And the author suggests 2 stories to check out on that program. One is called All at Sea, and the other, The Great Balls of Sugar. That sounds like fun to me. So check that out. And last but not least is our blessing for this month. Our author Teresa Honey Youngblood writes, "Blessed are the playwrights, script writers, poets, authors of all kinds on page, stage, screen, and across airwaves, for through them we know story. Blessed are the bookmakers, the pamphlet staplers, the blank notebook fillers, the digital creators and curators, for through them we know story. Blessed are the illustrators, painters, drawers, paper and fiber artists, photographers, for through them we know story. Blessed are the stage performers, actors, dancers, comics, magicians, singers, acrobats, and musicians, for through them we know story. Blessed are the interpreters, the caption scribers, the audio readers, for through them we know story. Blessed are the translators within and across generations, for through them we know story. Blessed are the story keepers and storytellers, those who make space in mind and heart for the stories that teach, that sustain, that warn, that spread wisdom. Like seed banks, they keep safe the germ of who we once were and who we may yet be. And blessed are the listeners, those of us who take the nourishment of stories into our very selves. We who let stories change us, who ask the question that begets all great sequels and other imagined futures. And then what happened? Blessed be and enjoy your storytelling. Till next time.